Ram, I was thinking when we were having some technical problems there a few years ago at District Assembly, Olivetians were singing, and a bad storm came through and knocked the power out. There were no lights in the sanctuary, and we were at gathering place. You know, there's no windows there, so the emergency lights above the doors came on, so there was a little bit of light. And of course, laptop computers have a battery in them, and so it just kept playing that music. But of course, it wasn't coming over the sound system because the power was out. The Olivetians just kept on singing. They were so used to that song, they were singing it, that when the power came back on, they were right on beat with the music that started playing again. I'm just reminded that no matter what happens, we can worship God. He's with us, He's here, and He wants to do something for us. So technical problems or not, we just go on and worship and let God fill our souls with more of Him. 10 Commandments, our relationship to God. When God came and delivered the 10 Commandments to Moses, He came in fire and smoke to deliver them. If you look at Exodus chapter 19, you find the scene viewed from the foot of Mount Sinai of thunder and lightning, and the Bible tells us with a thick cloud over the mountain and the sound of a very loud trumpet. The people stood at the foot of the mountain, and as they looked up, smoke as though they said from a furnace billowed up. The mountain trembled violently. Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered. And what did he speak? The Big Ten. Not the football Big Ten, but the Big 10 Commandments. No other gods. No other idols in the form of anything. No bowing down to them or worshiping them. That is the second commandment. Thou shalt not make any graven images. Now, last week I mentioned the first commandment, no other gods before Him. The first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods, gives us the object of our worship. God is who we worship. Nobody else. It is Him. God up in heaven. The second commandment is our manner of worship. Thou shalt not have any graven images. The Bible says, you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, it goes on and says some other things there, but I'm not going to mention those right now. I am reminded when I start thinking about worshiping God, and we talked about this in men's Sunday school class this morning. We worship God in spirit. It's not a particular place. It's not something right there in front of us. John 4:24 says, we worship in spirit, in truth. Not in a place, not to an object. God is a spirit, and He makes His presence known in our lives. We take Him with Him everywhere we go. If you look over in Ezekiel 32, you find the story of a golden calf. It seems that they keep making these golden calves and different things because they want to see the object of their worship, not just feel His presence, not just realize it's a spirit. And I find that story of the golden calf being made kind of ironic because here is Moses getting the commandments from God. Thou shalt have no other gods, and thou shalt have any graven images. And the people are getting restless and wanting to see what they're worshiping, and so they start making these golden calves again. Exodus 32 refers to worshiping idols as a great sin. And when you come right down to it, it's back to that 10 commandment. God had saved Israel. It wasn't the golden calf that saved Israel. It wasn't Shagar, the gad of cattle, that saved him. It wasn't anybody else that saved their souls. It was God that saved Israel from disaster, from bondage, from the thing that had torn them apart so bad. It wasn't anything else. And so when you stop and think that God saved Israel from bondage, Then He gives them His laws to keep. It's the only way to keep it is to get rid of all hindrances. And so, if I'm looking at the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, then I have to look at the second commandment and say, the only way I can follow the first commandment is to get rid of all of the other gods in my life. The only way that I can worship God in spirit is to get rid of anything else, any hindrance that is causing me to worship. I've been in a few homes down through my life that have been very interesting. We had some church members years ago, and I say years ago because if you live like this, don't tell me about it. I don't think any of our people live like this. They often said, don't come to our house. There's nowhere to sit down. And I thought they were joking. And I had to stop by their house one day, and I knocked on the front door, and they opened the door, and they wouldn't let me in, but all I could see was a path that went through the living room and through a door that you could tell was the kitchen, because you could see a kitchen countertop that had no space on it either. Their 8-year-old son told me that the whole house was that way. Even to go upstairs to the bedrooms, they had to walk up a narrow path up the steps in between all the stuff and into the bedroom, and he had just enough room to walk along the bed and lay down in his bed at night. They could not live in that home properly, and they didn't spend much time at home. They ate in restaurants a lot. Both mom and dad worked long hours, and it was just one of those interesting situations. They decided that they needed to stay home more. And so you know what they started doing? Cleaning house. Actually, if I remember right, they rented a big dumpster and just started filling it. They figured if they hadn't used those boxes in 4 or 5 years, there was nothing in them of importance, and so they just started pitching stuff. They started in the living room, and they rejoiced when they actually found the couch and could sit in it. You think I'm kidding? I am 100% serious. They slowly went in and started cleaning the kitchen, and they rejoiced when they were able to stay home and eat a meal at home and sit down at the kitchen table rather than on the step or any place else that they could find to sit to eat. You see, in order to properly use their house, they had to get rid of all the hindrances that were in it that were keeping them from really living in that house. When God says to us, you will not have any graven images, He's saying, get rid of all these hindrances that keep you from really living the life that I meant you to live so that you can worship me and I can take care of you properly. Thou shalt have no other gods before me means I've got to get rid of everything that could keep me from living for God. I'm only free to allow God to work when I clean my house. My spiritual house. These people had a lot of gods in their lives. I mentioned some of them last week. They worked at cross purposes to each other. They were a community of equal beings. You had the God of cattle and the God of water and the God of rain and the God of the crops and the God that caused the Nile River to flood so that the silt would come into the land and properly fertilize it so that their crops would grow. And all these gods had to work together. Some of them were weaker, some were stronger, but they were all seeking to bring their own will to reality in the people's minds. It was a hopelessly unpredictable situation. A human being could only try to remain in favor of the most powerful gods that might do him good rather than harm. You remembered I mentioned one god last week. I can't remember his name, but you didn't want to make him mad because he was the god of turmoil and chaos and of storms. And if you made him mad, some big storm would come along and wipe out all your crops. And the god who was in charge of crops couldn't do any good because the other god had overtaken him. It was a terrible life. So God knew what He was doing when He said, no idols. No graven images. Worship me. I will take care of you. Now, there were a couple of types of idols back in those days. Isaiah 2:8 says, they worship the work of their hands, that which their own fingers have made. There were people, that was their jobs, making graven images, and people would go and buy them. So they would have something to sit in their house that they could look at and be reminded, that's one of the gods with a small g that we serve, that we worship, that we pray to. But then in Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 2 and 3, we find these words, these men have set up their idol in their heart and put the stumbling block of iniquity before their face. I looked at that verse this week and I really thought about it in light of some reading I did a few years ago and some things I looked at this week, and I thought, what are the idols in my heart? What is this verse really talking about? Attitudes? Desire to get involved in materialism? The desire for money and more of it? The desire for things? The desires that we would almost die for because they become so important to us. And God is saying to us, do not think of me as the most powerful, invisible force to be reckoned with, yet finite, limited powers. I am greater than all of these other things in your life that could drag you down spiritually. Don't let any of them become a god in your life that drags you down spiritually or emotionally or physically to where you cannot worship me. I look at God when He says, I am the Lord your God. You will have no other gods before me. I am the Lord your God. Do not worship any graven images. And I am reminded that He is not one of many influences like all these other gods were. He is God, the great I am, the deliverer, the one ready to make a full commitment and a full covenant. He's not going to just take care of my crops. He's not just going to take care of the rain. He's not just going to put clothes on my back. He's not just going to make sure I have food on my table. He's not just going to make sure I have shelter. He's going to do it all. It's not one thing or the other. It's the whole big ball of wax right at one. I am the Lord your God. I will take care of you. Do not worship anything else. Do not have anything else that you worship above me. Don't have any images that you put in front of me. I start thinking of all these other gods that they served back then. The things that we can get involved in today that can become pretty important. And when I stop and think of everything that most of us are involved in, all the aspects of our life, all the things in our lives, and I have to say that there's nothing in the visible realm that can adequately capture who God is and what He is like. Ephesians 3:20 says, to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than we can imagine, and His power works within us. He, God, is too big to be understood in human terms. We can only think about God and what He can do. But when it comes right down to it, what does that say again? To Him who is able to do immeasurably more than what we can even think or imagine. We come up against these problems in our lives and we start thinking, well, here's how I need to work it out, and here's what I need to do, and Lord, give me wisdom. But we forget about His mighty, mighty power that works everything out in His time for our very best if we're serving Him. We can't even imagine what God does for us behind the scenes. We just know that things work out sometimes, and there's no explanation for it, because He has done immeasurably more than we could even imagine. We cannot worship the shrunken deity of our imaginations. Our concept of God too often is He's a grandfather type who sits up in the sky somewhere and gives us things. How many times do we beg to God, oh Lord, give me this. Lord, do this for me. Lord, do that for me. Lord, meet this need. Lord, meet that need. The correct concept of God is He's our Creator. He's our Savior. He's our Deliverer. And when we begin to worship Him and realize that's what He does for us, then He becomes our everything. Matthew says it so well. I mentioned it last week. I've mentioned it probably hundreds of times in 20 years. Keep God and His kingdom first place, and all these other things will come to pass. When I start thinking about that, I start thinking about all God does for us. It doesn't leave room for unworthy thoughts about God. If we regard Him like us, in human terms, we're asked to form a just and true idea of a divine nature, a divine spirituality, a lofty majesty, and all-encompassing holiness. We don't need an idol to worship God. I'm reminded that when Moses talked to God on Mount Sinai, there was no form. Moses did not see God. The smoke billowed, the thunder roared, the mountain rumbled. And God's voice came and spoke to him. The Bible tells us that no man can see the face of God and live. Colossians 1:15 says, Jesus is the image of God. If we really want to know who this God is that we serve, if we really want to know when He says, I am the God, I'm taking care of you, look at the life of Jesus Christ. He is the image of God. Love, compassion, salvation, deliverance. I read a book written by a Jew on the Ten Commandments, and in this book the author says, to the Jew, the second commandment was a fence to guard the empty shrine until the Word would be made flesh. You see, people wanted something they could see, someone they could see. And even though they were beginning to get into this thing that God is a spirit, and we go to these places where we can say, surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. There's a sweet spirit in this place. God is with us. They still wanted to see something, and that's where the problem of idols, graven images, came in. But when the Jews look at that second commandment, it's a fence. Not to allow any of these other things into their lives. Because Jesus is the image of God. Now, they don't look at Jesus in the same way that we do. But Jesus becomes the image of God in the flesh so that we can realize God is alive and real. When we start thinking about worshiping God, we have to be emptied of all these other things in our lives. I'm reminded that if we're emptied of one thing, we must fill up with another one. I eat breakfast every morning. By noon, that breakfast has worked itself through my system and my stomach is feeling hungry again, so I fill it up with lunch. And by dinner, if I don't eat a big enough lunch, I'm nibbling by about 3 in the afternoon because my stomach is empty again and I need to fill it up again. And by 10 o'clock at night, that ice cream tastes really good. And long about 3 o'clock in the morning, if I happen to wake up, that handful of cereal tastes pretty good as well. You're going to say, Pastor's going to get fatter than a hog. Well, he already is. When I'm emptied of one thing, I fill up with another. In my spiritual life, if I'm not filling up with the power of God, then other things are going to come in and they're going to become the gods that govern my life. That's the reason for the fence of the second commandment. Keeping God first place. Now, this isn't just Old Testament stuff. If you look in the book of Acts around chapter 18 and different places in Ephesians, I think, you find that there were silversmiths. They weren't just the guys of the Old Testament that made the golden images. They were the people of the New Testament that made images that people worshiped by. And so when this came out in the New Testament, the silversmiths were making a false goddess called Artemis, an image of those. And people were worshiping that. And they had the daughter of Zeus, a giant temple of worship in Ephesus. And when the silversmiths looked like they were going to be put out of business because the Christians were getting so strong and were no longer buying the stuff from the silversmiths, there was a riot in Ephesus. Because people were giving up their idols for a new life, and people's financial lives were at stake, and they couldn't see how if they would worship God, they could do something else with those talents and abilities that they had. I'm reminded over in 2 Corinthians, the Bible says the old is out, the new is in. The old idols are out when we serve God. He is in and becomes the one who takes care of us. Now, there's a strange warning here in this second commandment. Reading on down from my left, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. As I look at that, I some years ago had to do a genealogy of our family. And my grandfather wasn't real helpful. And my mother finally told me why my Grandpa Chambers wasn't very helpful. Because somewhere back in the family, there was a bank robber. And he was ashamed of that. And a lot of strange things happened. There was a couple of moonshiners back in Virginia and Tennessee and in Kentucky. Well, Grandpa Chambers met Ethel Ferris. And so the Ferris clan came into the thing there for a while. And part of the Ferris clan was religious. Somewhere they had gotten, or God had gotten a hold of them. Now, just recently, one of the distant cousins on the Ferris side has gotten into some genealogy, and we're finding back in the Civil War days, there were some real characters there in the family. I mean, we're talking some bar owners and some bar fights that ended up in murders. And so both sides of my dad's family came from this horrendous background of these horrible people. And as I look back to some of this stuff, early 1800s, you keep going generation after generation after generation. It took 3 or 4 generations before it started straightening out. Somewhere in there, God got a hold of my grandmother's generation. Somewhere in there, God got a hold of my grandfather's generation, and it began to change. Now, I've always looked at my mother's side of the family as being this wonderful, peaceful family. And then one of my aunts got into some of the stuff there, and oh my word, I got to tell you folks, I come from some really interesting backgrounds, both on the Chambers side and the Swatman side. I mean, it's just, wow. And you keep going on down through all this stuff, and you see generation after generation after generation, but as we come into the more modern generations, somewhere it started straightening out, and people started getting pretty decent, and somewhere God got a hold of them, and it rewrote history. I look at my mother's side, my dad's side of the family, on my grandmother's side, and somewhere in there it came down to the very simple fact, God got a hold of somebody, and it rewrote history to where there's 4 Nazarene ministers in the family. Well, one of them's passed away now, but several cousins and were there, Nazarene ministers, still active in ministry. It rewrote history. On to the 3rd and 4th generation. But once the generation starts straightening out, what does it say? Showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Because you see, once people fall in love with God, once people start turning their lives over to God, they start passing that on down to their kids. Generation to generations. It took several generations to straighten out the mess on especially my grandmother's side of the family. To begin to see a love to 1,000 generations. But what's the promise there? To those who love and keep my commandments. I see a pattern. God delivers. We trust. We begin to trust Him completely. When we follow Him, we have the blessings. Now, I've been in many of your homes. I haven't seen idols on your bookshelves. I've looked. I cannot look into your hearts. Only God can. And I sometimes wonder, what's He finding in my heart day by day? And so it becomes a day-by-day thing with the second command. It's a call to destroy all idols. It's a call daily not to make any new ones. It's a call daily to leave space for Jesus Christ. It's a call daily to leave a legacy for your family that will allow them to be blessed. I'm sure I could open a whole can of worms here with a whole bunch of different things today. We have godly people in our church whose generations after them are not serving God. We have people today that are part of our church, either online or here in the house, that could say, but I've been praying and praying for years. I've been serving God for years and years. Where's the next generations? All I can tell you is keep serving, keep praying, keep living the example, and God, the great shepherd of love, will come to us and reach out to us and just remind us that He is still in control. Keep Him number one. Keep Him the only one that